So the title of this session is Sustainable Solutions to Water and Climate Challenges, and this is part one of a two-part session. My name is Paul Hicks. I work with Catholic Relief Services. I will be joining the other presenters today in one of the presentations, but also introducing this topic and introducing each of the speakers. I've been to this conference a few times, and every time I'm just impressed with the caliber of people who are here and the commonality of the missions that we have as researchers or NGOs, as policymakers, as farmers, journalists, and others who are involved in the challenge of meeting water and food needs around the world. The Water for Food Conference highlights the role of water security and global food supply and how agriculture impacts on our water resources. The mission is to discover how we can more effectively and efficiently manage land and water resources to meet the global demand for healthy food while sustainably and equitably managing water resources. So the presentations in this session focus on that mission. And what we're looking at is the challenges and the solutions of climate change, its impact on our food supply and our water resources, and how we respond to that effectively with solutions at regional levels, specifically in the Horn of Africa, at community levels, and at the farm level. So each of those presentations will address that at these different levels. What weaves these three presentations together are two things. The first one is that each of the presenters is going to be sharing some work specifically in the Horn of Africa, and all three have a footprint in Ethiopia at a policy level, at a community level, and then at a farm level. The other thing is something a little less direct, and that is coffee. And Ethiopia is the origin of coffee, and it's grown in many countries all over the world. Most tropical countries have coffee. California, it turns out, also has coffee. So what we are going to be putting on offer here is two coffees. One from the origin of Ethiopia that was brought to us from Ethiopia, and the other is from El Salvador, which is where I'm based, and where we're going to be presenting on some of our work also in El Salvador. And so we're going to be offering these up to the two questions that are most interesting and most challenging. And the judge for those is our advisor and friend, Jack Alexander from Synergy Solutions, and the most critical person that I know, and which is why we hire him as our consultant and advisor. So Jack, you're up. So our first presenter is Sagai Tedesi. He is from the University of Nebraska, from the Drought Mitigation Center. He's a research professor of applied climate and remote sensing, and he teaches geospatial technology. His presentation covers drought monitoring and management in the Horn of Africa, specifically in Kenya and Ethiopia, and seeing that the critical problem is that most countries rely only on crisis management approach to deal with drought and climate change, which is often not effective and often not well implemented. And he makes the case for integrating a drought risk management approach into national policies, then implementing well-informed drought planning and mitigation strategies. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. Again, my name is Sagai Tedesi. I'm research professor of applied climate and remote sensing here at the University of Nebraska. And I'm also geospatial coordinator at the National Drought Mitigation Center, which is also located here in the University of Nebraska. So my presentation would be on drought monitoring and management in the Horn of Africa. And I would like to share my perspectives on the current drought management, specifically in Kenya and Ethiopia. To give you a background, about 44%, which is about 100 million people, live in areas prone to extreme food shortage and recurrent drought. The region is threatened by famine at least once in a decade, and it's more frequent in recent years because of the climate change. For example, 80 million people were suffering from food shortage in 2006. In 2010 and 11, the drought affected more than 30 million in this region, the Horn of Africa. Recently, about 36 million people are affected by the most prolonged and severe drought in recent history. So that includes about 24 million in Ethiopia, about 8 million in Kenya, in Somalia, and 4.5 million in Kenya. So, according to World Food Program, in 2016 alone, among all the countries in the world, 50% of the people affected are in Africa. And recently, FAO also showed on their food insecurity map the region, Africa in general, but the Horn of Africa are really affected by recurrent drought and food insecurity. According to IPCC, the models projections show increased frequency and severity of drought conditions, so that is really making it worse. In IPCC in 2023 recently mentioned that impacts of climate change as well as the growing population and declining per capita agricultural capacity are expected to further threaten food security. So climate change is real and it has impacts, and it is also having increased frequency of extreme weather events, including drought. So what should we do? And we have to manage this natural disaster, but how? There are two ways of disaster management, including drought. One is the reactive. When it happens, then try to respond as quickly as possible to save lives and the economy and other sectors. And the second one is the proactive or the risk management, which is being prepared, planned, and also having a monitoring and early warning system before drought happens. And this was advocated and was really preached as much as possible by Professor Don Wilhite and Mickey Glanz, the need for a paradigm shift from this reactive or crisis management to proactive drought risk management. And they mentioned governments should prepare for droughts by developing and implementing strategies and plans that reduce associated impacts. That was in 1985 and still true. And by the way, Professor Don Wilhite is one of the top drought experts in the world, and I'm fortunate that he was my advisor when I was doing my PhD 20-something years ago. So in order to do this and to have a drought risk management before it happens, we have to map out a strategy. For that, we need a strong partnership, innovative financial solution, most importantly, efficient and effective leadership to implement it. That would lead drought-resilient Africa. It's cut here, unfortunately, but one of the several efforts to build strategy for Africa, the drought risk management for Africa, is in 2016 in Namibia, a group of scientists led by the National Drought Mitigation Center and World Meteorological Organization, UNCCD, and FAO get together, and so we wrote a strategic document for Africa, which is a strategic framework for drought risk management and enhancing resilience in Africa. And that was presented for the African ministers in Namibia, and it was adopted, and more so, there was also adoption of Windhoek Declaration of Enhancing Resilience to Drought in Africa. And that is based on the 3 pillars of integrated drought risk management. This includes drought monitoring and early warning systems, drought vulnerability and impact assessment, and drought mitigation and response. So there are several activities being done in Africa in general and the Horn of Africa, on the region. And so I'm giving you 2 more specifically examples what's being done in Ethiopia and in Kenya. And by the way, I have a vested interest in Ethiopia because I'm originally from Ethiopia, a proud African and a proud Ethiopian. So in Ethiopia, because of the drought in the 70s, and there was an ad hoc response to the drought crisis created called Relief and Rehabilitation Commission. It's just only for the relief and the rehabilitation, not to be prepared for that because it has already happened. And even after that, whenever drought happens, then they go on and try to help out those who are the victims of drought. And later on, it was evolved into Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Commission. And in particular, in 2004, this Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Commission evolved to the formation of Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Agency, DPPA, and later the drought risk management and food security sector under the Ministry of Agriculture. So that was a bit of progress in trying to build this policy of drought risk management. And in 2013, Ethiopia published a document, National Policy and Strategy in Disaster Risk Management, and it was adopted by the Council of Ministers, and Ethiopian Disaster Risk Management Commission was established in 2015. So there was a bit of progress in that, and this commission oversees all disasters, including drought in the country, which is accountable to the Prime Minister. And here is the structure of Ethiopian Disaster Risk Management Council. And it's, as I said, under the Prime Minister office, and there's a commissioner. And if you see this structure on paper, it is really great. And the one I mentioned, the 3 pillars of drought risk management are almost included in this on paper. The biggest challenge is how is it implemented so that to reduce the impacts of drought and to save millions of lives of its people. And how is this implemented is the biggest question. And I will just share you my perspectives based on the recent droughts. The other one is Kenya. And in Kenya in 1985, drought contingency planning system in certain parts of Kenya, that's in Turkana, was designed. And later in the early 90s, Emergency Drought Recovery Project was coordinating anything about drought when drought is happening to help out mainly those the victims of drought. So later, Kenya established country program framework for ending recurrent drought emergencies, so that it's just one step moving forward to drought risk management. And 6 top-level experts came here in Nebraska at the National Drought Mitigation Center, and we have given them a 2 weeks hands-on training on drought risk management, monitoring, and prediction, mitigation, and responses. And then in 2016, the Kenyan government established the National Drought Management Authorities. These high-level experts have also contributed to this. And so this National Drought Management Agency or Authority in Kenya is a platform for long-term planning and action, as well as a mechanism for coordination government and with all other stakeholders. Again, in Kenya as well, in terms of policy and the way forward, there is a big progress towards risk management, but again, the implementation is not as we would like it to be. So there is room for a big improvement. So whenever we talk about climate change and we are saying that there is an increase in frequency and severity of drought, and these three might show you how the three main drought years could be compared to each other, just drought years to drought years. In 2010 and 11, 2 seasons failed. In 2016-2017, at that time, that was the record, and 3 seasons failed. Recently, in the 2020-22, all 4 seasons failed. So that's what we are really observing in terms of drought frequency and severity in the Horn of Africa. NASA reported that in 2022, the most severe drought in 70 years of record, threatening the Horn of Africa with famine. So the problem is there. And the Eastern Africa, for example, the Horn of Africa, sometimes being called, an estimated 24 million people in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia needed humanitarian assistance. In Ethiopia alone, the lack of water and grazing is driving households to migrate alongside their livestock in search of water, pasture, and food. So about 23 to 26 million people faced acute food insecurity by February 2023, a few months ago. That they are facing catastrophic food insecurity outcomes. Again, the 2022 Global Hunger Index that shows the severity of food insecurity shows Africa, compared to other parts of the world, has serious to alarming food insecurity situations. So this really how you can see how the recent drought is really impacting the food insecurity, leading to famine. FEWS, that's the Famine Early Warning System network, in August 2022, really warned the world's worst acute food insecurity emergency of 2022 is occurring over the Horn of Africa. And severe levels of acute food insecurity are expected to persist in southern and southeastern Ethiopia, afflicted by a multi-year historic drought. These were reports provided online, and also and these informations were available in August 2022. But after that, you can see so many lives were really impacted, and so many days also occurred in the recent drought. And the statistic is not yet there, but we know several people died because of, or impacted because of the recent drought in southern parts of Ethiopia and northern part of Kenya. So there are the challenges, and the challenge that most governments have not given a proper priority to drought risk management, relying on the crisis management. Even if we see the policy is really great and still they are addressing the impacts, the disaster or drought when it happens. That's lack of a full commitment. The social and political issues related to race and gender need also to be addressed. And even though there are some progress, the role of women in drought risk management is limited. And severe drought, together with the complex socioeconomic and political factors, has been the growing motivation for migration. Many people are displaced. And the lack of financial resources is really a big challenge, as always, because it's developing countries, both Kenya and Ethiopia, and capacity building is really a big challenge. And as I mentioned, IPCC and other models also projected an increased frequency and severity of drought as a big challenge, even though there are some progresses in general to adopt risk management policy, at least on paper and somehow on their government policies. The implementation of the policy and the structure is not yet efficient, resulting loss of life and other several damages. So my final thoughts. In summary, the current experience in the Horn of Africa countries indicate most governments have not yet given a proper priority in implementing drought risk management and continue to rely on the crisis management. And this was evident, as I showed you, by the severe levels of acute food insecurity in the region, loss of several livestock and displacements in recent drought. What should be done? There are necessary mechanisms for implementation of a strategic framework or drought plan. That includes strong political will and leadership. And there should be also an initial investment by the countries themselves in building greater institutional capacity, and then also the international community can help them out. And there should be a collaborative environment that supports coordination within and between national institutes and all levels of government and the private sector within each country. That's really lacking. We don't see a good collaboration and coordination, and that's also really having a big impact. And for implementation, it needs an engaged and supportive citizens and stakeholders. And also, it involves engaging research community, including higher education institutes, extension agents, and strong outreach and media programs. So in summary, the recurrent drought in the Horn of Africa, exacerbated by the climate change, requires more effective drought planning and the development and implementation. I would like to underline implementation of appropriate mitigation strategies to reduce its impacts. By that, I would stop it here, and the next two speakers would have, at least I highlighted the challenge, they would give us some kinds of solutions, and we can, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tedeschi. As we said at the start, Dr. Tedeschi's presentation looked at the challenges and recommendations for solutions at a regional and a national level. And now the next two presentations are going to be looking at solutions at first a community level and farm level, and then next at farm and watershed level. The second presenter is Rebecca Merrifield. She is a senior designer at IDE, an international NGO. She's based in Ethiopia, and she has been in East Africa for the past 7 years. Her career is focused on facilitating change in the areas of women's empowerment, youth engagement, and community development. With IDE, she's focused on solutions related to water and agriculture. She will present on a case study of agro-pastoral youth in Ethiopia.
Okay, good morning, everyone. As Paul mentioned, I'm Rebecca Merrifield. I'm a senior designer with International Development Enterprises, or IDE in short, and I'm based in our Ethiopia country office, where I've been working for the past several years. So today I'll be sharing with you, as he mentioned, a kind of case study of how IDE is working with agro-pastoral youth in the lowlands of Ethiopia to diversify their livelihoods and hopefully to mitigate against the effects of climate change. Okay, so I don't want to go into too much detail because I know Dr. Tedesse already gave you a pretty thorough background on the current situation in the Horn of Africa, but I will tell you a little bit more about the specific area in the lowlands of Ethiopia where IDE is implementing a USAID-funded project. So we are implementing this project in the colored area that you see here on the map, which unfortunately essentially overlaps with the area on the map that he showed, which was completely dark red. And that's really the area which is experiencing this extreme drought currently and for the past several years. So today I'll be talking about specifically the zone in blue, which is called South Omo Zone. And this area is semi-arid. It's mostly inhabited by agro-pastoralists and pastoralists. There is a large river called the Omo River, which runs from the highlands all the way through this zone, and it empties into Lake Turkana. This lake is shared between Ethiopia and Kenya, so the border actually runs through the lake there. So I'll be talking later about essentially how youth are using the Omo River for irrigation. So just a bit more background on how this region in particular has been experiencing this severe drought recently. As he mentioned, especially in Ethiopia, this has been the worst drought in the past 40 years in the country. And in South Omo Zone alone, about 300,000 people have been significantly impacted by this drought. Over the past 6 months, 14,000 livestock have died, and 3 million more are in urgent need of water and feed. So this is a very dire situation, and actually in this zone, it's not even as worse as the other areas more to the east. So in addition to the severe drought that's currently happening, there's also an increase in natural disasters over the last several years and even decades. So just a few years ago, there was also a desert locust infestation. There's also been overflow or flooding of the river more than usual. So this is causing people to be displaced as well as significant crop damage for those who have been planting near the river. In addition to that, there's also been some weakening of the traditional rangeland management system. So this is partially due to the fact that there are various ethnic groups living in this region. When they need to travel farther distances in search of sufficient pasture and water, this creates even more conflict between these ethnic groups. And they're essentially not really able to rely as much on their traditional rangeland management system. Beyond that, there's little in the way of infrastructure and markets in this region. And again, as Dr. Tedesse mentioned, this is partially because the government has put very little attention on pastoral development in this region. So in all, kind of the confluence of all of these impacts recently have really led to the agro-pastoralist livelihood being less and less of a sustainable and viable livelihood system as it was for previous hundreds and thousands of years. So this brings us to the project where IDE is implementing in a consortium. This is the USAID Feed the Future funded project. We're implementing with 2 other NGO partners, which are Global Communities and GOAL. So there are multiple components to this project. IDE is just implementing one part, but the other components include disaster risk management, and improved rangeland management systems, improvements in the crop and livestock production systems, as well as nutrition initiatives to address the challenges around food insecurity. But IDE is specifically working with youth to diversify their livelihoods and engage in opportunities, especially to do different kinds of activities and to use the natural resources in a more effective way, which will be a little bit less vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So why are we working with youth? This younger generation, as you might have already understood from his presentation, is essentially facing the worst severity of drought, natural disasters, as well as growing population pressure. So in the past, when drought hit, essentially agropastoralists would just move their herds even farther and farther distances in search of the pasture and water that their livestock need to survive. As I mentioned, this is becoming less sustainable, especially due to ethnic conflict. More recently, they are essentially relying on government and NGO handouts for humanitarian aid. So they are often bringing water, food, as well as forage, potentially hundreds of kilometers away, down to this lowland area so that pastoralists can simply survive with this food aid and water that they need. So both of these methods are no longer viable. It's not very practical to be bringing fodder from many hundreds of kilometers away. It's also breeding this culture of dependency rather than encouraging adaptation and using critical resources in a more effective way. So we believe that the youth are really the kind of next generation to be able to diversify their livelihoods. They're relatively open and willing, and they're kind of facing these push and pull factors which are forcing them into changing their own livelihood system. So this leads me to human-centered design, actually. So the agropastoralist community has been relatively misunderstood. As I mentioned, the government has not been very focused on pastoral regions. They are often trying to use agricultural practice and knowledge from the highlands, which is not always very appropriate for the people as well as for the agroecology. So IDE is using a human-centered design approach to more deeply understand what are the unique needs and challenges of youth as they are trying to navigate this changing environment to respond or mitigate against climate change. So human-centered design, without going into too much detail, although it is my role, so I'd be happy to talk with anybody about it later. It's essentially an innovation methodology which is meant to develop context-specific solutions and to really focus on solutions, not problems. So rather than focusing on drought as the key problem, we're really trying to understand who are the youth and what is the experience that they are facing, that they are moving through in order to diversify their livelihoods. So we do this by starting with developing a deep understanding of agropastoralists. So what are their needs, their challenges, their aspirations, their motivations? What is the human behavior behind who they are and what they are doing? We're also trying to understand what are the opportunities and challenges in the market. So because we will be engaging them in different types of business opportunities, we needed to know, what is the situation of supply and demand in the current market system. We then undertook a collaborative co-design process with different stakeholders, including community members, experts, government officials, as well as private sector, to start to generate ideas and business models that might be a viable alternative. And finally, we are currently piloting different income-generating activities and business models, mainly with youth in enterprise groups. So this is really the human-centered design process that we go through. So one of the income-generating activities that we're really focusing on, especially in this area, is irrigated commercial fodder production, mainly due to the presence of the Omo River, as well as the dire need for forage in this region, especially due to the drought, of course. And also because we see that youth are relatively open to trying out new agricultural practices, because irrigation was not previously used in many regions. They were previously growing cereal crops in the floodplains, which was due to the natural overflow of the river. So these groups are currently organized as formal enterprises with the local government enterprise office. And they have a savings account with a local microfinance institution. And this is allowing them to be able to save in order to purchase the inputs that they need. We also partnered with a regional research center. This center has co-invested. They're also providing technical training so that the youth can learn how to prepare the land, how to seed, the irrigation practice, as well as how to harvest properly. The group is currently using diesel pumps to lift the water from the Omo River. They previously have tried solar pumps, and we can talk about this a bit later, but right now the kind of easiest method for them is to use these diesel pumps, and they're using a furrow irrigation practice. And they're actually working on land that has been designated by the local government. So because land is communal and pastoral areas, we needed to work with the government for them to be able to use this land which is adjacent to the river. So when they harvest, they're doing a few different things with both the forage and the seed that they're harvesting. So about 30% of their harvest is coming, they're using it in order to feed their own livestock. Some of the remaining that they harvest is being bought by NGOs and even by governments as part of like crisis and drought response activities, and it's then redistributed to other agropastoralists in the community. They're also selling some of this forage in local markets, maybe to traders and to other agropastoralists nearby. So I'd like to just introduce you to one such group who is living right on the border of Kenya, which has been operating since 2020. So for the past several years, they have been growing and producing fodder. This group is comprised of both men and women, so they're sharing the tasks and the responsibilities together. They're also saving, so they have their own individual savings accounts as well as a group savings account. And they have been growing 2 different species of fodder, which are appropriate for the agroecology. So I'll just give you a brief kind of overview of how this group has been doing so far, to give you a little bit more insight into how it works for the group over the past several years. So the first harvest they didn't sell, but their past 4 harvests that they've had since 2021, they have been selling both the herbage and the seed. And just to note here that the chart shown here is only showing sales, not the total production. So as I mentioned, about 30% of the fodder is being used for feeding their own livestock. The remaining 70% is then sold. So this is the sales shown here. The average profit per youth per sale is a little bit over $100. So this is actually very, very significant because usually most pastoralists are not really engaging in business as they're relying on their own cereal crops and livestock for their sustenance and consumption. So beyond the kind of obvious impacts of, okay, it's great that they're generating income, right? There are several other impacts at both the individual as well as communal level. So for one, by being able to feed their own livestock, this is preventing livestock death. It's also preventing off-taking measures, which usually happens before the peak of drought, so that they can at least earn some income rather than losing their livestock. But obviously they don't really want to do that because they want to be able to sell at peak market price. So by feeding their own livestock, they can essentially save them and maintain the healthy body condition of the animals. It's also contributing to family food security and nutrition. As we know, pastoralists mainly rely on livestock for their main nutrient sources. So again, by keeping their livestock healthy, it means that they're able to consume the butter, the dairy, and of course the meat as well. It's also supporting a changing lifestyle. So pastoralists are usually nomadic, but in more recent times, they're becoming more sedentary, maybe having more interaction in town, going to markets. They're also sending their children to school, which was not previously the case. So by generating income, they are able to support their children going to school. They're able to buy some household goods, which might be very critical. Again, since they haven't really been doing business before, this approach is really supporting youth especially to gain business and entrepreneurship skills. It's also creating more connectivity in the market, again, because they weren't necessarily going to market and selling their products. And now there's increased market linkage as they're selling to other agropastoralists, to traders, and even private companies. And finally, it's decreasing this dependency that I was talking about. So rather than having to bring this water from hundreds of kilometers away, it means that these youth, by producing and selling, are able to provide more of a local solution to a local problem. So I'd like to share just a few of our lessons learned, which I hope will be helpful to you. We actually started piloting irrigated fodder production during a previous project several years back. And this really allowed us to create a partnership with the research institution. It helped us to select the best fodder species for the area and to start honing in on what those improved irrigation practices should be. As I mentioned, we are also collaborating with the local research institution. They have provided co-investment, they are providing the technical support, and so this has been really crucial, and we hope that because of this relationship, that beyond the lifetime of the project and IDE's presence there, that partnership will continue, so that those who are engaged in irrigated production will continue. Strong government support has also been really critical. So again, because the resources, including the river and land, are usually governed by local government, it's really important that we work with them and develop a strong relationship. So what's next? Of course, there's always room for learning and for improvement. So I'd like to share a few of those with you, and I hope that we will also continue learning from each other. So there is a high potential for seed certification and multiplication. So this has pretty stringent requirements. It's quite difficult to meet all of those requirements. However, if youth producing groups are able to meet those requirements, they would be able to scale up production as well as to sell at potentially higher prices. They could become outgrowers for private companies and potentially sell at much higher prices. Right now, the youth don't have an improved storage facility, so it would be really helpful if we support them to have this improved storage facility, and that would increase the shelf life as well as the transportability for both the bales as well as the seed. This would help them to be able to potentially save the bales for when they really need to use it at critical points, as well as to transport it and maybe sell to other regions which are a bit farther away. There's also a lot of room for improvement in terms of water management. So again, because the river is governed by a local government office, there are frequently some issues and conflicts between those who are using the river, how much they can use and when. So this can sometimes lead to over-irrigation, under-irrigation. It can also affect the timing. And of course, all of that influences the final yields of the fodder. Another area is we need to really improve the pump use and maintenance. So they're often out of operation, sometimes they break, they could be missing spare parts, or maybe not able to afford the fuel. So we are thinking that we should really work with a few to train them so that they can really keep these pumps in operation for more days of the year. Finally, we are thinking to also explore potential opportunities on crop rotation and intercropping. So this fodder species is actually a fast-growing species. They can harvest after only 45 days. So this means that the youth could potentially be harvesting and earning profit like 7 to 8 times throughout the year. But we know that depending from year to year, the potential drought situation, that might not be necessary. The youth might also be interested in growing other crops which have the potential to earn income. Or they might be interested in growing some nutritious crops to feed their families and not only their livestock. Some of the youth are actually already doing this. They are growing some different types of fruits and vegetables as well as moringa. And we know that especially for soil conservation and preventing nutrient depletion, it might also be interesting to pilot planting some nitrogen-fixing crops, especially cowpeas or other varieties which might be appropriate for the agroecology. So these are just a few areas that we'd really like to improve, and I hope that we can continue learning from each other. I know that this is quite a brief case study, but I hope that it's given you a bit more insight into not only the challenges that Dr. Teresa mentioned, but also what could the opportunities be? How can we use a market-based approach so that we can not only utilize water as a critical resource in a better way, but also even to generate income, even during extreme challenges such as drought. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Becca. After this next presentation, we'll open it up for questions. Two things. One, just to prep the questions, it would be very interesting to hear a little bit about Dr. Tedeschi. How do you take those experiences from the field that you're hearing, and how does that contribute to the higher level planning and decision making that's going on at the national and the regional levels? For those of you who entered in later, there's a competition on the questions on the most interesting question and the most challenging question win a bag of coffee from either Ethiopia or El Salvador. And so this third presentation is by two of us, Derek Schlee and myself. Derek is Principal Senior Ecological Engineer at Limnotech. He has a master's in agriculture and engineering from Ohio State, and he has expertise in water modeling, green infrastructure, and water quality monitoring. I am from Catholic Relief Services. I have been working overseas for more than 25 years, most of that with Catholic Relief Services. And working in the nexus of water security and food security. About 7 years ago, we started working with Limnotech to start exploring the modeling and analysis of a few agricultural practices that could have the greatest benefit in terms of water, reducing erosion and increasing water infiltration. And Limnotech, with Derek, led that. We started in El Salvador, went to Ethiopia, and then have brought it back to Central America. So that will be what we're presenting on over the next 20 minutes, and then following up questions for any of the presenters. So as I mentioned, we started looking at this in El Salvador. Water insecurity in El Salvador is in crisis. Severe threats to streams and rivers. 90% of surface water is contaminated. And then 50 of the most important streams and rivers of the country have lost 30 to 70% of their flows over the last 30 years. Most of the high elevation areas in El Salvador are dominated by coffee agroforestry systems. There is very little national parks or full forests left in the country. And so what we recognize is the way to manage and protect the headwaters of some of the country's most important watersheds is to improve the way that we are growing and processing coffee. When we started out this, we looked at a study that the Nature Conservancy did in 500 countries, 500 cities around the world, looking at what would be the most effective ways to protect, ensure water supply for those cities. The conclusion of this report was that the greatest potential to secure water for cities lies in improving the management of agricultural lands. And that's because so many of the watersheds that impact people's water supply is dominated by agriculture. So the conclusion that we have is that good agricultural practices can lead to good watershed management. We asked ourselves, what are the few agricultural practices that are most effective at reducing runoff and erosion and maximizing water recharge on coffee farms? And to do that, we started working with Limnotech, who looked at this to develop a modeling tool called the Water Benefits Calculator. And Derek will present on that.
All right, thank you, Paul. So this question really transitions well into the next slides on the goals and objectives of the Water Benefit Calculator. And as Paul mentioned, we started this work around 2016, maybe late 2015. And I'll also acknowledge the initial funding was provided by the Inter-American Development Bank. So really the Water Benefit Calculator is a decision support tool, and you might ask what kinds of decisions is it supporting, and it really gets to that question on the last slide. It supports decisions regarding which types of agricultural conservation practices are most effective as well as cost efficient at reducing surface runoff and soil erosion from coffee growing farms in Central America. And one of the things that we sought out to was to provide a quantification or an estimate on the hydrologic benefits as well as the sediment load reduction benefits of those interventions to help folks like Catholic Relief Services prioritize the actions that they're taking by understanding the cost effectiveness of those practices. Here are some basic details on the Water Benefit Calculator, or WBC as I'll refer to it. After constructing it initially as an Excel-based spreadsheet tool, we finalized it as a web-based platform, and you can see that in some of the images on the right with the graphic user interface that we created. It represents the hydrologic cycle at a farm scale or field scale along a hill slope. And again, that was tailoring it to the needs of the Central American application, which you could think of looks similar to the image we have in the background here for the conference. So a user of the WBC would be able to create various baseline condition scenarios and future hypothetical conservation scenarios, things like land cover changes or introduction of various structural or non-structural interventions, some of which you see photos of on the bottom, specific to the coffee growing areas. We use the modeling algorithms of a tool called the Hydrologic Simulation Program in Fortran, or HSPF. So if anyone's familiar with that, you know well what it is. And for those of you who are not, it's a mechanistic process-based model that's really well established and widely used throughout the globe to simulate watersheds. It can also simulate reach routing, but what we did was stripped out the pieces of the model that were most important to us, and that was the pervious land segments, and particularly the water balance components that you see listed here on the left, as well as in the flow chart on the right. And we thought that was advantageous as opposed to simpler modeling techniques for the coffee growing regions, because it could simulate those processes like canopy interception, infiltration, evapotranspiration, storage of water within the soil profile, ponding, et cetera. And one of the things that we structured with the WBC was a long-term simulation period, a multi-year simulation period to represent different meteorological conditions. It uses an hourly time step and reports overall on average annual output, but we do have the capability to look at diagnostics on a finer time scale like daily output. So after the WBC was developed, our first application focused on 6 real-world coffee farms in a small sub-watershed within El Salvador. And by working with on-the-ground information with these farmers and the practices that they were using, as well as some geospatial information like slopes and soil types, we were able to simulate or construct scenarios for both with and without different interventions. And some of the images on the right show the different interventions that we used: infiltration trenches, terracets planting shade species, or different live barriers. So things that increase ground cover, as well as provide some filtering and slowing down of the water so it's not running off the landscape so quickly. And actually, it's a convenient photo. If you look at some of these images on left or right of me, you can see what some of the bench-type construction might look like along a mountainside. And on the bottom left here, we have example results that are generated by the WBC. So on the left is the water budget, and for this particular application at Site 1, we found that by introduction of those 3 different practices you see, surface runoff could be reduced on the order of 50%, and that's beneficial because it creates more infiltration, more soil storage of that water for eventual plant use, as well as additional evapotranspiration and then slower recharge in terms of base flow to the system. And then the sediment load was not quite reduced by 50%, but on the order of 40% for that particular site. And most of my focus will be on higher level information about the WBC and applications, and not too much of a deep dive into the results. So a second application expanded to additional farms in Central America in the countries of Honduras and Nicaragua. And another thing that was unique about the second application, and this was happening around 2017, 2018, was quantifying both the prevalence or popularity of the different practices or interventions, as well as the cost. So we can understand what maybe have the most benefit, but are they the most costly? So trying to introduce costs into the equation. And an overall finding here, and Paul will get into this a bit in his next slides, are that really any practices that could increase ground cover, things like cover crops, as well as shade tree plantings, were among the most commonly adopted, as well as least costly practices. Some of those structural practices, like installing a pit or a bench, take more effort and therefore cost more. So a few years later, after the El Salvador version, Limnotech and Catholic Relief Services partnered again to expand the WBC, this time in the country of Ethiopia that we've talked about in the first 2 talks here in Africa. And so I'll go through some of the various changes that we made to the WBC to tailor it for the Ethiopia application. The first was that we decided to go with a desktop-based platform instead of a web-based platform, and that was due to internet connectivity issues and thinking about the intended use and whether web-based platform would work. I should acknowledge this funding was provided by the USAID for the Ethiopia application. Another important overhaul was the introduction of almost a dozen new crops, as well as different types of conservation practices or interventions. So you see 9 different crops listed there on the bottom right. Things like small grains, different vegetable crops, ground nuts, beans were all important to this particular area of Ethiopia where we were trying to apply it, which was really focused on the highlands of Ethiopia, so a little different than what Becca described. We did have good intentions to travel to Ethiopia to actually collect some site-specific data to constrain our model inputs and outputs, things like conducting infiltration testing or measurements of soil erosion, as well as hosting some training sessions with folks that might use this WBC. But unfortunately, the pandemic happened right around the time we were supposed to travel, and that was unable to occur. A little more details on some of the enhancements for the Ethiopia version. First, we enhanced the model hierarchy and structure. And one of the things that we found that was unique to this area of Ethiopia, which is common grounds or publicly owned land really, is that we had dozens of different producers or farmers growing different crops in their area. So instead of a single private landowner, we had, again, dozens of farmers. And so anywhere along a hill slope or mountainside, you can almost picture it like this room. Every single row of chairs was a different crop. And then you just go over another 10 meters to the right or left, and you have a very different type of transect. So we wanted to introduce that flexibility in the WBC to have that granularity of different cells adding up to different transects for a given scenario or plot area. And then you can have multiple plots along a hillside. We also explicitly added a cost-benefit module that factored in both the crop production costs, things like what are the seed costs, fertilizer or pesticides, labor estimates, as well as the anticipated revenue based on information that we had at hand. And lastly, important and unique to this Ethiopia application was, I mentioned we intended to collect some site-specific measurements to help parameterize the model as well as calibrate it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that, but instead we looked to the scientific literature as well as on-the-ground research that had been conducted in similar situations in Ethiopia to help us understand and constrain our model predictions of things like the surface runoff predicted or the sediment loads predicted to ensure that the model results from the WBC were reasonable. And you see that in the bar charts on the bottom and left there with the WBC in the darker shade and different literature sources that we compiled to the right. Okay, lastly, I'll finish with some lessons learned, starting on the left with the advantages and successes. Really, by using the best available information and location-specific information, as well as coupling that with well-established mechanistic modeling techniques, we feel that the WBC was able to be tailored to meet the needs of the individuals using it. In this case, Catholic Relief Services was the most significant user. And it also had a relatively simple inputs as well as easy to follow instructions. So that was really critical for the success of the WBC to be used, outside of Limnotech's initial development. And in doing that, it was able to provide the valuable information on putting a quantity on the hydrologic and water quality benefits of both existing and planned future management interventions. All of this, coupled with other information that Paul will get into to point to the vital few conservation practices that were worth promoting in these areas. Also mentioning some of the limitations and recommendations from my perspective, really prior to any decision tool development effort, and we've done several of these, a critical thinking and information gathering phase is extremely important. You need to not just jump into the tool development with what you think makes the most sense, but sit down with those users, meet with them frequently, figure out what their needs are, what most value they try to get out of the tool. I mentioned this on the last slide, but the lack of location-specific field data to calibrate to or constrain your model is always going to result in some inherent uncertainty in the model prediction. So as the modeler, it's your job to do whatever you can to compile location-specific data or other anecdotal information or look to the scientific literature to do what you can to constrain those model inputs so that the outputs it predicts are as reasonable as possible. This is really an often overlooked aspect, but it's important to try to constrain your model predictions to make sure that you're providing valuable information on the back end. And lastly, something that I always advocate for as a modeler you have to recognize that the model predictions are just one of many pieces of information that should lead you to which interventions you want to promote in a given geography. You need to think about the cultural, social, political influences, things like the practicality, the ease of installation for the farmers or producers, as well as the likelihood of adoption. So it is just one piece of the puzzle, but an important piece that we were able to quantify here with the WBC. And with that, we'll go back to Paul to wrap it up. Thanks.
Thanks, Derek. So for us, working with a group like Limnotech is how do we get smarter and better, more effective at what we're doing in development practice. So we started with the question, what are the few agricultural practices that are most effective at reducing runoff and erosion and maximizing water recharge on coffee farms? When we take what we've learned from Limnotech and then what we learned from our own field research, we're looking for simple solutions or recommendations for farmers. And our number one principle on this is keep it simple. So training and extension can get exponentially complex with the number of new farm practices we introduce to farmers. And this is what we find. Sometimes development projects are promoting 10, 12, 15, 17 different agricultural practices that farmers should be adopting on their farms. And that's just not realistic for most farms to be able to change or add in so many different interventions. So the question is, what are the few? What are the vital few practices that make the biggest difference? And the WBC has been very instrumental in helping inform our decision on that. Cover crops. It's a simple solution, but what we found in practice and through the results of the WBC is that cover crops are a seemingly simple solution that can have transformational impacts on farms and downstream impacts. This person on the right, Wilfredo Garcia, he's a farm manager at Noruega Farm in Apaneca, and what he's describing right there is the impact that cover crops and live barriers had on this farm right after hurricane-type rainfall in El Salvador in 2020. 2020, and then this actually experiences as a storm in 2021. And what he's explaining is that there were trenches and pits dug on this farm to collect rainfall. And in previous years, those pits were filling with sediment and water. After having a good establishment of cover crops and live barriers, water did not make it into those pits or ditches, meaning water was absorbed in situ, in place on the farms where it was having the benefits of improving crop productivity in the root, by keeping moisture in the root zone. So this is an example of where we're using jack bean, Canavalia, planted as a cover crop and a green manure between rows of coffee plants. This is an aerial view, giving credit to Raindrop, a company that we work with in El Salvador, who's been doing our field monitoring. So on the left is a coffee farm with cover crops, and on the right, without cover crops. Without cover crops, farmers are often using high amounts of glyphosate and other herbicides to take care of weeds. In the case of the use of cover crops, we're able to suppress almost all of the unwanted weeds on the farms and encourage a diversity in the understory of the farms. So in addition to the WBC, we also set up erosion plots on coffee farms and also on maize farms in El Salvador, where we were measuring the amount of water that was coming off these erosion plots and the amount of sediment that was coming in there. And so these are three 50-gallon drums that are collecting water and sediment, and those were collected after every rainfall event. Tedious and hard work, and we've been doing that for 2 seasons, 2021, 2022, and now we're moving into 2023. I'd love to give you the results that we've seen on the ground, but you wouldn't believe them, so I'm letting ABC, the Alliance Between Biodiversity and CIOT, they helped design these erosion plots and then worked with our teams on the ground to collect the data and analyze it. essentially what's coming out of there is that there was a tremendous amount of water and sediment coming off these plots that had bare soil or managed traditionally, and virtually nothing coming off the erosion plots that had cover crops on them. And we see that on the farm, and we're seeing it actually in the erosion plots, and it's consistent with what we're seeing with the water benefits calculator. So the conclusion from the question that we started with is that the agricultural practices most effective at reducing runoff and erosion and maximizing water recharge on coffee farms are: 1, keep soils covered with cover crops and crop residues, and 2, plant live barriers along contours, ideally leguminous plants, bushes, and trees. So we've taken those and we've made them the heart of the Renacer Coffee Training Center in El Salvador, which this year won the Sustainability Award from the Specialty Coffee Association, a global award from the specialty coffee industry. The school was started in 2019, and now in 4 years later, the school has these 2 practices, cover crops and live vegetation strips on farms, as core elements to the training modules that we're using. And we're seeing the benefits on small farms and large farms, and we're also applying the same practices on maize, on beans, other fruit crops, cacao, and multiple other crops, and happy to share with you those experiences. This is all part of an initiative that we call Blue Harvest. The idea is promoting regenerative agricultural practices to improve and protect water resources. This is an example of a poster it's all in Spanish, but it's a poster that's part of these modules that are explaining to farmers that go through the coffee school what are the few practices, how do you apply them actually on your farm, knowing that every farm is different and we have to modify to every context. Thank you very much. Now we would like to enter into a question and answer session, and I will invite you to walk to the microphones. I'm not able to see questions if they are in the app, but welcome. Please come to the microphone if you do have questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Badru. I'm from the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFRI. I have 2 questions for the first 2 presenters. But before I ask the questions, just for the benefit of the audience here who do not know Ethiopia very well, let me just briefly say a little bit of paradox in Ethiopia when it comes to the water resources. You know, most people who do not know Ethiopia may think that Ethiopia is a completely desert and dry country, but that's not the case actually. So Ethiopia has a very huge water potential, both groundwater and surface water. And for the drought issues that the first speaker talked about, is yes, drought is a natural phenomena, but actually one of the key challenges in Ethiopia is the use of water resource in Ethiopia for most of the problems we have. So having said that, I would like to just have 2 questions to the first speaker. The first question is on the comments and on the recommendation you suggested, Dr. Sagaye, on government actions, that government should take action Y, action B, actions. So I think we have been saying that for quite a time, and we don't see much actions taken in government, as we all know, for the last so many years. And with having all the nice institutional setup from all the institutions we laid out, from the prime ministers and the structures and everything, yes, that's nice in the paper. But honestly, being an Ethiopian, I'm an Ethiopian, I know very well the country, that's why so, you know, we don't have those things happening. And I think I would like to say farmers should do X, farmers should do why farmers should do that instead of government. Government's not doing much so for all the decades. So I want to see what farmers should do at individual level. I want to hear that comment. Secondly, the second question is on your solution. I was expecting you to mention about something on irrigation, smaller scale irrigation, because one of the, I think, the solutions we should think about in Ethiopian situation is using the available water source from agriculture. And especially we have huge groundwater potential and surface water potential. And if you don't think to use those resources, I think by just pointing to governments and other donors, we may not get where we want to go. So I want to hear your comments on how about your experience and your comments on use of water to somehow to mitigate the challenge of food security in Ethiopia. So for the second presenter, I'm happy to see that the irrigation that we talked about on fodder production, but I want to ask you two questions. First, you said you are a designer, so I hope you designed very well in terms of the interventions, right? So you didn't tell us how you selected those young people that you did the interventions, because if you select already those enlightened and educated and so young people who are close to the market, already exposed to some interventions, then the impact will be completely different than randomly assigning those interventions or somehow designing in different ways. So I want to hear the design aspect of those interventions. And secondly, the scaling. You didn't say anything about what's the strategy to scale. If that project is successful, do you have like a strategy to scale up? Because I know that region, I'm from the southern part of the country just by chance, and I know those areas very well. So it's a very vast area, all the way from down to the Kenya border. So it's a very big area, and I wonder how you plan to scale this intervention if you find it successful. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. As you have seen actually from Baker Mayfield's presentation, and that would really indicate what farmers should do and could do. And there are the water resources issue in Ethiopia, and we know Ethiopia is known as the water tower of Africa. And there's groundwater in those lowlands as well. And it is possible to pump the water and irrigate, but it needs and requires resources. And resources in terms of manpower and a lot of and other technologies as well. And you can see from Baker's presentation, and they were doing it for fodder production, and that can be really scaled up and do other crops, including cover crops, based on the soil, the climate, and environmental factors that affect those crops, so that we can do production. And the other thing which stood out on my Baker's presentation for me is actually, which is also related to his question, she might answer on that. For me, which stood out is to try avoid dependent mentality. So always, drought is recurrent, and so you just make them in the safety net and then give them always, the help, but they couldn't come out. The better solution is like the small project that Baker showed us, that they can make money and produce and cover for their own, for example, the fodder production, for their own livestock, and could also sell it and then make profits. That should be the way forward. And if it's scaled up, and then that dependent mentality would be gone, and taking out also from the safety net, and the farmers could do their own production, and they could not only for their own, but also could produce and sell it to others. So that's what I'm thinking of based on what the farmers could do. And that also should be, of course, be coordinated by the government, and international help is very important. I don't mean that's not important, but it is important, especially with the crisis management. There's no way that you can just ignore the dying people and dying livestock, and you have to help them. But that crisis management is not sustainable. In order to be sustainable, it should be done by scaling up, and try to avoid dependent mentality, and also, as I was mentioning, do the risk management approach.
Thank you. I'll just add a little bit onto what Dr. Tedessa mentioned. Let me answer the first question actually about the selection of these youth. So yes, it is difficult to kind of figure out who will be the youth or those who can engage in such kind of business. So we selected them based on a little bit of their education status and experience, as well as their kind of proximity to the river and their current land holding and agro-pastoral practice. We did have to spend a significant amount of time trying to figure out what would be the appropriate business model, because agro-pastoralists, they don't usually work in groups in this kind of business model that NGOs usually propose as a means to provide inputs, training. It's usually the model that governments and NGOs promote because it's the easiest. So we try to select them based on their interests, their willingness, their desire to work together in a group, because often these groups are formed by NGOs and just become totally dysfunctional and not beneficial. The second thing on scale, well, first of all, I'm sorry that I didn't clarify that the group that I shared as a case study is producing on 4 hectares of land. So that's the land that they own, or that they're working on together, which was designated by the government. There are a number of other groups which are operating in the same region, but a huge challenge to this is cooperation with the government, to be totally honest. Just in an adjacent woreda or region, the government does not want to designate their land to groups for this purpose, so they're not able to do it, and it's not something that IDE can totally broker or negotiate. So that aspect is also very difficult. There is potential for groundwater use, as you mentioned. We are also currently working on groundwater rehabilitation points. I think, as he also mentioned, there's a huge cost to that. So again, it's kind of like, who does the responsibility or the cost fall upon? So even though we are now essentially using USAID like crisis modification money in order to rehabilitate these groundwater points. And I think the priority for that water usage is more for household needs as well as for livestock. It's not really on irrigation practice right now. So I think there would have to be some kind of policy shift about whether or how they can use that groundwater more for agricultural purpose. And finally, and again, with the relation to the scale up, as you can see, this really depends on the presence of a river or a stream, which has the capacity to support such kind of irrigation. Another area that we are looking at, you mentioned the border going all the way down to Kenya and Moyale. Right now, there are other NGOs which are piloting hydroponic water production, so there are not river or other surface water there. So they are piloting hydroponic, which can produce about 7 to 8 kgs of water with only 1 kg of seed. And I can't remember off the top of my head the amount of water. But we're also thinking about piloting this because this could be an even more efficient way of using potentially groundwater or any water available to produce the same crop much more effectively.
So please go ahead.
Yep, so we've got a question from one of our online participants. Brian Bruns asks, what happened with the solar pumps in the IDE project, and what are the issues, advantages, and disadvantages versus diesel pumps?
Okay, that's a great question. But the short answer is that they were flooded. They got washed away. I mean, the main challenge really with the solar pumps is the availability and the affordability. They're incredibly expensive. They need to be imported. Although, yes, there are solar pumps being used in other parts of the country. It's a challenge, especially to purchase and transport these, which are almost like 800 kilometers from the capital city. even just the economic and political environment in Ethiopia right now, it's very difficult to do business or to import anything. The cost could be literally triple of the initial costs, say, of what you might pay for a solar pump here. So affordability is a big one. Another thing, again, is, even there's issues around maintaining the simple diesel pump, so we really need to work on kind of proper maintenance and care. With solar pumps being a little bit more complicated, we also would really need to work on, educating those in order to use them well and to manage them. So that's kind of the short answer, and it's something that we really want to look into further, especially maybe some innovative financing around how they could afford those, because again, right now, like, they're sharing the cost of inputs when it comes to seed and also to the pumps. There's kind of a cost sharing between the agro-pastoralist youth, IDE, as well as the government. And we really don't want to continue this culture of dependency or free handouts. So, with the solar pump being quite expensive, we need to figure out some innovative financing as well.
So go ahead.
My name is Sylvia Carlson, and I'm a farmer here in Nebraska. So what I'm wondering about on the coffee farms, and my question I think actually could be for all four of you, is what happens with the unintended consequences? Like, I was thinking of your cover crops. And so I was imagining cover crops on our farm, or the things. I'm thinking, there's a lot of history of crops that were brought in and saying, well, let's do this. And then the unintended consequences, it becomes invasive, or, certain things that weren't thought about by the scientists and engineers and so on. But in a way, then I thought about that same question can be asked for things like in this examples in Ethiopia, because I noticed that one of your mentions were that you were bringing together these pastoral peoples were not typically working together. You've got ethnic groups coming together and so on. And from the outside, we can say, oh, well, they'll change policies or they'll change practices. That can't be easy to do. So what and how do you think of unintended consequences?
Great question. The best people to answer this question actually is a team from El Salvador who have been leading this work on the ground, who are here at the conference. The simple answer would be that we are not introducing something that is new. It's not widespread, but the use of cover crops on hillside farms, on flat farms, is as old as agriculture, but they have been outmoded by the expansive use of herbicides over the last many decades. So the idea is reintroduce them and showing the direct benefits on farm productivity, and then the downstream benefits that we're looking for in terms of reducing erosion and improving water recharge. So there's not a lot of things we don't already know about introducing these different types of cover crops in a coffee farm system in Central America and many other parts of the world where many of these, so that no new seeds have been introduced. It's the extensiveness of them, and then the application of field trials and research and the modeling with Limnotech have really taken us to another level in terms of understanding and being able to model and measure those downstream benefits. I am going to take one final question, and then perhaps we could pass the microphone for other responses. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Abraham Solomon. I work on irrigation in Uganda. I guess my question is related mostly to the Ethiopia context and Horn of Africa more generally. I think these are areas which are primarily pastoralist, and their traditional lifestyle has been based on much smaller populations than exist right now, and migration to areas that also in the past had lower populations and more rainfall. And in a modern economy where states don't allow, states protect private property, and they don't allow people to bring their livestock to graze on other people's lands. It seems that the general livelihood of people there is very much at risk. And traditional coping mechanisms with drought are not possible. Now, the solution that was mostly mentioned had to do with irrigation, which also a question in terms of the possibility of using diesel pumps for irrigating things like pasture, just because very few pastoralists will have the ability to purchase pasture, which would be very expensive. Other ideas for irrigation related to irrigation schemes created by the government could make the fodder itself much cheaper, but we see most schemes are promoted for cash crops, things like sugarcane, rice, which really also wouldn't help the pastoralist community so much. So it seems the question I'm really looking at more is, from your perspective, is the issue really more about the provision of infrastructure, general infrastructure, such as roads, schools, health center, electricity, to create viable off-farm alternatives, as traditional coping mechanisms are not possible anymore? And things like irrigation could be possible in some regards, but in many places it won't, and at scale in many places it won't. Also, the problem of irrigation is even the water sources that do exist during multi-year droughts also become very, very low, very low on water. So I think as we've seen in Somalia, in the Shabelle River and in the Omo River, these are irrigating communities, but they can't irrigate in years of drought because the water resource is not there. So I just wonder your opinion on the general provision of infrastructure and other economic opportunities outside pastoralism.
So a big question that I think have several sessions for in the next 2 days to respond to, but I'll give very brief answers from the two of you, and then a final comment from Derek, and then Jack will award the bags of coffee.
Well, my answer is just in brief. The traditional approach should be enhanced by the modern technology, not necessarily just take out the traditional approach that whether it's farming, the way they live. So it should depend on the traditional way, and that's how you can sustain it. Otherwise, just introducing a new one, any modern technology is really a challenge. And in terms of the pumps, yes, it is very hard to have the solar pumps, as it was mentioned. Even getting the diesel fuel is really hard. And there is also one other opportunity using the manual. It's not effective, not efficient, yes, but that could also be helpful.
First of all, I really appreciate your nice summary of our entire panel and presentation. I think, the difficult answer is both. There is an element of needing to really work on the infrastructural aspect in terms of roads, health, education, and the government is putting much more attention on each of those, and it's very much more the government's role. From our perspective, especially from NGOs, yes, irrigation is one method, but like ID is really focusing on livelihood diversification. So I actually said the word youth, but there's a term for those who we say are like transitioning out of pastoralism, or they're called TOPS, which I don't really like to use that term because I don't think that they will ever really transition out of pastoralism. So we really believe that diversification is the way forward. We're not only working with youth in irrigated production, but really to maximize other types of activities as well that are not dependent on water resource necessarily. So some of those include poultry, beekeeping, moringa. There are a number of different livelihood activities that we are supporting. So I think that's really the way forward in terms of supporting youth and all agropastoralists to be able to have a source of income to support their livelihood.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'll actually jump back to the previous question because I had a little bit of thoughts there on the unintended consequences of things like cover crops, and I think this is a general answer for any type of solution that has unintended consequences. But my side as an outsider's perspective, I think that there's a few things. Number one, connecting with those on the ground individuals that have went through the process, maybe some innovative individuals or farmers that have found successes, that have found ways to deal with the unintended consequences and continue to adapt the conservation practices that they've been implementing. So yes, it's easy to sit back from an outsider's perspective and push that this is the best solution, but really trying to continue to learn as you go and adapt what conservation practices are recommended. And again, I think the critical piece is trying to connect with the on-the-ground individuals like Paul mentioned.
Thank you. We're now out of time, and Jack, declare the winners.
So the most interesting question goes to Sylvia.
Sylvia, is Sylvia? Here's your Ethiopian coffee. Becca will be the one to answer that. And Abraham, your El Salvadoran coffee. Thank you very much for your participation.